All right, trying the new mic today. Lapel mic. I don't know if this will work or not. I bet you I'd hurt your ears banging this thing around today. This is going to be fun. All right. We'll start off. One of the things that my wife, she's probably the best critique I have. She'll or the best critic. She'll say afterwards, this is what you should be doing, and this is what you should have showed us, or whatever. And so probably in the future, I'll have to listen to her, and we'll build a slide about when we talk about dispensationalism and premillennialism. It's kind of it's educational to at least see what is believed out there and where they get those ideas from the Bible. Rather than assuming that we all are so familiar with that we're just kind of jumping around in some passages and talking about it in general. So, and we will probably have that kind of time later on, because when we get into the later chapters of Daniel, I don't think they'll take that much time after we're probably through about 9 or 10. So we can do that. But in general, what we're talking about is I want to let you know, why is it important for us to address it? When we're talking about Daniel and the prophecies, and we know that these belief systems are out there, and the religions have kind of, clawed into this and taken it and start running with it and making it this big thing. Why is it important for us to spend time with that rather than just going through Daniel and talking about the things that we actually believe in? This is why. Because there's so much contradiction and confusion with regards to the Bible, with the way they begin to interpret prophecy. It is very difficult to begin to defend the truth to the world itself when they look and they understand that there are these charlatans out there, like a Hal Lindsey, that would come up with the late great planet Earth, and then be able to make a big splash on the scene in the 1970s, and then say, look, the earth is going to end in 1988 before December 31st. We know that from a prophecy in the Bible. So how do you think that looked then to the landscape of America in general when 1988 came and went, and there wasn't a peep? And that's exactly, and so not only does it look bad for religion in general, because remember, when you talk to your university professors, they're going to say, well, this is how bad Christianity is, and they're going to lump you in with what? Maybe the Crusades, and they're going to say, look what the Christians did in the, well, they have a stark misunderstanding, don't they, about Christianity. What they're talking about are empires that maybe painted a red cross on their shield and then went to war. That doesn't make them Christians, and they were not Christians in the least. But it's the same kind of misunderstanding to the skeptical world about these prophecies. And then, in and of itself, if you're going to take the Bible and you're going to take that kind of license about when you read these the prophetic language and the symbols and all of these things, if you don't grow up in a disciplined system that disciplines you about the way you approach your Bible study and what we call exegesis, which is just a big word meaning interpretation. But if you're not disciplined with those things, then you run on with all kind of contradictions. And so it really behooves us then to point out that, listen, Bible study is about disciplining yourself just like it would be in any other scholastic endeavor. And you can't take prophetic language that are symbols and things like that and begin to interpret them themselves, for yourself. One of the things that is very, very prominent in dispensationalism and the entire theory is that every generation thinks they're the last generation. That's just a mark of it. So from the very beginning there's something deeply flawed with it. If you can see yourself in the last generation of the Bible every time you turn around, regardless of what that generation is, there's something deeply flawed with that interpretation. It's getting so bad that I'm starting to hear from Christians in the church that'll say, well, you know what, just the way things are going right now, it could be the end of the world coming up. You know what, all that is a very shallow understanding of history. If you think America is bad now, and it is going down into this degradation of paganism, and paganism we'll define later, we'll talk about it, where morality and the values of a society are separated from its religion. That's what paganism was. And we'll see that with Nebuchadnezzar. He had no concept of morality being tied to the gods of which he bowed down. And the same things happen in America, where values and some moral code is completely divorced from any religious significance. So that's paganism. But as we see and as we go down this road, I will tell you, you will not experience anything different than people in history have experienced. So to say that, well, things are getting so bad, well, you look back and you study history a little bit. There has always been these cycles, and God's people have been on a pinnacle for a while in this country, in Western civilization, and that has crumbled. The entire foundation is gone now. But as we go down into this where every man pleases himself, and so therefore starts to persecute his neighbor, because you have to, and paganism has to persecute Christianity, I guarantee it, then you'll understand that this is just another cycle in history that the Bible explains, which is another reason why you say, regardless of your feelings about the Bible, I will make this statement: man cannot live without God's word, period. Every time he tries to do that, he preys on his neighbor and makes a mess of society, culture, the social order, the family, the individual. And as people try to please themselves in the glorification of sexual gratification and all these things happen, you're going to find that it's less gratifying. And then it leads to bloodlust, much like the coroner in New York, when he had done like 10,000 cases and as a coroner, and he wrote a big book about the face of death, and I think it was very famous, some years back. But one of the statements he made in there was about this, when he sees this aggravated murder where somebody's not only killed, but then there's the desiccation of the body and all of this stuff. He says, we knew we were looking at a sexual pervert, a homosexual or something like that, because it led to that. Now, that's just an individual with his own experience. But that's what happens in the societies that begin to go after the glorification of self and the sexual gratification of society and all of that. If that's what your idol is, then it leads to bloodlust and after that. Now, what we're told by society is the reason that's happening and the suicide rate out of the perverted communities is so high is because there's a shame there, and they're trying to that's the last plank, right, in the political spectrum, is to rid themselves of the shame. If they can do that, then of course they wouldn't have that kind of guilt or whatever, that battle internal is going on. But their mistake is what? The shame that they're feeling is not coming from society, certainly not now. It's coming from a different source, and they're never going to be able to get rid of that. The dispensationalism distracts people from their Christian duty and simply makes them mark time with this expectation that Christ is coming back, so why worry about anything? In other words, now I could just divorce myself from any responsibility I have in the community and not worry about maybe extended family members and all these things, saying, well, the Lord's coming back here pretty quick, so it just really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how I work, doesn't matter if I plan for the future. My 401k doesn't really matter. Christ is coming back any day. I know that from the scriptures. Well, if that's the case, you just become an irresponsible citizen. And you're not taking care of the business that God put you here on earth for. And that has happened in the past consistently. They would quit their jobs, they would dress in white robes, they would go into these communes and communities, and then they would live just kind of in expectation that Christ was coming back and all of these things. But instead of influencing society and being out there grinding away and being the influence they need to be, they were checking out of society saying Christ is coming back. And that we see is the same kind of attitude they have today. It also undermines the supreme importance of the church. If we expect that the kingdom of Christ was prophesied and was not established, and that maybe Christ came to establish the church. Why would they say that anyway? I mean, that he came in the beginning to establish the kingdom but gave us the church instead. Because passages like Mark 9:1 are so powerful, it's hard for them to kind of wiggle their way out of that. So if he said, there are some that stand by that shall in no wise taste of death. In this generation, when Jesus is talking, that shall see the kingdom of God come with power. If the kingdom didn't come with power, they've got to come up with an answer for that. Their answer is that he was rejected by the Jews and therefore did not set up that kingdom that he wanted to set up, but gave you the church instead. So that could lead to, well, I want Jesus, but I don't want any part of the church. Okay, I get that. I understand that. Hear that all the time. Well, guess what? What if it is instead when he said, in the days of those kings, the Roman Empire, the fourth kingdom, following Daniel, in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people, and it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Then what if Christ said, well, yes, that's my kingdom, that's my church. Now you try to diminish the church. You're diminishing his everlasting kingdom. It doesn't sound as good, does it? And that's exactly what's happened with the church. If it's an interim measure, it's not that important. And it leads to this next point right here, which is we don't have to determine so importantly when it started, when it was established. If we're going to argue about the kingdom and we're going to debate that, then we're going to fine-tune that and find out when was it inaugurated. But if we're talking about the church as an interim measure and it's just one of these spiritual holding places, then it's really not that important. And what happens is, if we don't understand when the church started or when he inaugurated the kingdom and when Christ sat down on his throne, if we're a little wishy-washy about all of that, we'll come up with any way for terms of admission into the church, into the saved body that he said he shed his blood and redeemed not the individual, but the church. Right, in Ephesians chapter 5. So that's pretty important now when we understand that there's a correlation, but we continue to have these debates with individuals that may point out and say, well, John the Baptist was a member of the church, and that's the church that I belong to, or something like that. Well, what's the problem with that? We already looked at Matthew 16, right? John had already lost his head, was buried, and gone when Jesus stood there in Matthew 16 and said, I will build in the future my church. Simple English, simple Greek. It's in the future. It hadn't been built yet. And then, of course, he was going to give the keys to Peter and have him use those keys. And so we would look and listen for Peter someday in the future to stand up and preach a different message. And he did that in Acts chapter 2. But if you don't understand that the church started in Acts chapter 2, you'll argue all day long about the thief on the cross or John the Baptist. I always say, well, why are you giving me the thief on the cross? Why don't you tell me you're saved like Abraham was? Why don't you tell me you're saved like Noah was? They're all in the same dispensation until the cross, the resurrection of Christ, and the day of Pentecost. That's why it's important. It's not one of these where we could say, well, there's a little offshoot group over here in Liberty Church or whatever, which is not the case if you're from Liberty Church of Christ. I'm just using that as an example. But let's say somebody does, and you say, well, they're starting to be into this dispensationalism. Well, it is a big deal. It's a big deal because now you're going to be off on everything. And it really leads to all kinds of things, and particularly, though, just the way you understand the Bible. When God gives prophecies and gave symbolic language, you better look for an inspired interpretation of that language. And we have it, and it's numerous in the New Testament, particularly in Acts 2. So you got a simple state from an inspired preacher of the gospel who said it was about the resurrection of Christ. But if that's not good enough for you, do you understand why there's a lot of things that aren't going to be good enough for you? And you're going to go on with your own interpretation, translation. All right, one more time on the chart. I know you're kind of tired of this, but first column on the left, you've got what he saw in Daniel chapter 2. That was the vision. And then in Daniel chapter 7, you got in the middle column. It's the same thing, talking about the same kingdoms, the same empires. And then over on the right, 2, 7, and 8, which really, if you said chapter 8, it would be the two middle, right? It'd be two middle. It'd be the goat and the ram. And you're talking about Medo-Persian and Greece. The only one that's not named specifically in the Bible 500 years before it happened was the fourth, which is the Roman Empire. But that was the fourth kingdom, fourth empire that followed Greece. So we know that it was in that time frame, in the days of those kings, God was going to set up his kingdom. And that's when the church was established. But if we look at that, there's other things that we kind of missed, and I want to kind of go back to a slide. I probably should have changed the slide. I changed the bottom. I didn't change the top. We asked, what was the fullness of time in Mark 1 and 14? Let me ask you this question, though. Had I done my homework and done this right, why was it the time? In other words, why didn't Christ come, the Messiah come when Noah came out of the flood? Why wasn't the Messiah sent when Moses led the children of Israel up to the Jordan River? Why wasn't he sent when they went in and it was at the end of the period of Judges? Why wasn't he there as a son of David to sit on David's throne during the kingdom period and the glory of Israel? Why wasn't it in the middle of the Babylonian Empire and the exile that Christ did come or didn't come? We don't know the answers to all those, but you can start to begin when you look at the character of God and the nature of man, in which the Bible teaches you that and gives you that worldview. Then you start looking at what the current events that we're talking about in Daniel look exactly how the world was prepared for the coming of the Messiah. The Medo-Persian or the Babylonian Empire was supposed to be what? According to Ezekiel, I think it's 43, a boiling cauldron to cleanse his people. That's the other thing about the nature of man that non-Bible readers will never get. And that is that you will never look to heaven until you're on your knees. But the boiling cauldron to cleanse them from idolatry. And so it was an exile and it was a captivity that the Bible had told them it is coming. And God said, I will not turn away and repent from this. You will be boiled in a cauldron of cleansing to cleanse them from idolatry, to get his people ready for the coming of the Messiah. That happened in the exile. And also synagogue worship. We take that for granted. Well, the Jews in Jesus' day had synagogues. When Paul went around the world, he started stopping in on the synagogues. A place where you would discuss God openly, that they were in expectation of the Messiah. How did that happen? Before the synagogues, where would you have gone to spread your message? Would you have showed up at the temple of Ishtar with all of these pagan sexuality practices happening and the bloodletting and all of that? Would you have showed up there and started preaching the Messiah and had a receptive audience? Just think about the skepticism of Athens when Paul went to Athens and they started listening to him about the resurrection there. So this was very important as a stepping stone and for an avenue for the gospel to be spread as quickly as it did around the world. And remember, this is something no skeptic can argue with. The spread of Christianity changed the world. There's courses over at Faulkner University that are probably not even taught in the depth that they should be, but the books are excellent, and I've read the girls' books and looked at them. But yes, Christianity and the spread of Christianity changed the entire world. And most skeptics would not in the least want to go back to prior Christianity, previous to Christianity, to live in that world. No way. But the synagogues were so important for the spread of the gospel. The Medo-Persian Empire gave us the rule of law and organization. When I say the rule of law, it's hard to imagine what the Egyptian Empire would have been like in their heyday in the dynasties. It was all power makes right. Whoever had the power made the rules, and it was very arbitrary. That lasted in the world that we know in ancient history right up into the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, we had the laws of Hammurabi, but that was something that could be changed at a whim of those that were in power. But in the Medo-Persian Empire is the first time in ancient history where we begin to read and see that if a law was made, those that were in power just did not have the ability to go and say, well, you know what, we're not going to follow that law. I mean, it happened, obviously. Those that are in power have always done that. And that's one thing about human nature, and the Bible teaches you. People try to gain power, gain more of it, and they abuse it. That's period. That's why we made the Constitution the way we did. Try to constrain all that. Of course, that's all gone. But The whole thing about power is, in Medo-Persian Empire, once that law was made, even the king had to stay under that law. That's way different. The world is changing drastically under this Persian Empire with Cyrus and then Xerxes, of course, and it starts changing. And Darius was a huge part of that, about making these laws through the provinces, and not even the king could change those laws. And of course, the Bible writers knew that. That's why they were so intimately familiar, and they used those kind of languages long before we learned from archaeology that they knew what they were talking about. Also, organization. You remember I had mentioned this one time, I think maybe it was even a previous class, but if you were in Susa or Ecbatana and you wanted to send a message all the way over across Asia into, say, the Hellespont and go up at least to the edge of the European continent there in the Aegean Sea, it would only take you a week. Now you pull out your atlas and look at the distance that is. From present-day Iran all the way over through the Asian continent, all the way up into the Aegean Sea. And then you think about the transportation they had. It would take the king a week to get that message, and then another week for it to get back, because they had the first Pony Express. They had stations along the way, and they would ride those horses, and they would just take one rider after another, jump on the horses, and then they would switch the mail pouches and all that. So anyway, that gave them incredible communication lines that we had not ever seen before in the world. The Greeks gave the world their language and rationality. Now, I know that's a misnomer. I'm not going to say that the world was irrational and there was no rational thinking before the Greeks. But if you're thinking about Socrates, Aristotle, remember there's a difference between what they were trying to determine and how they were trying to go about and determine it with empirical evidence and things and philosophies of their mind, as opposed to what? When we see that Xerxes went up to the Hellespont and how before he crossed, he sliced the liver of the animal open, and he had the enchanters, the soothsayers, the mysticism, and they would read the liver. Like, how are we going to do in this battle? That's what I want to know. And that happened with Nebuchadnezzar as well, right? Shake the arrow, read the liver. He did all that. All that enchanters, the mysticism of the Orient. That begins to change drastically with Greece in the West. And that's why civilization itself changes when it goes from the history of the East to the history of the West for the first time in Greece. But that's because things are now, they're looked at very differently. And we needed a world to begin looking at the world in rational terms and ask the tough questions about where we came from. Just like in Romans chapter 1, when God said, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known of God was manifest in them, because God manifested it unto them. For the invisible things of him, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that he made, even his everlasting power and divinity." Right? There's not a scientist in the world, to include Stephen Hawking, that was ever able to describe and explain through the laws of physics that we have where the universe came from. That's why I quote my favorite, the astronomer and the physicist from Arizona State University, complete atheist. He was at least honest. He says, when we talk about the Big Bang and we talk about the burbles in space and we talk about space-time and all that, he says, all that's theory. He goes, well, that's just dodging the question. He goes, we still want to know where that came from, and we know now as much that it would be just like saying, well, it all came from a piece of rubber, and we want to know where the rubber was spawned from. He knows that. He knows they can't go back to time zero. That's just not the way the equations work. And that's what God is saying. These things are visible. We're here now, even talking in a Bible class about the meaning of life and the meaning of man. You don't get that from a rock. You don't get that from an animal at the watering hole in Africa. It's different. So the Greeks gave us rationality in that factor. Roman Empire gave us the ease of travel and citizenship, which was very different. Even though only about 2% of the Roman Empire was non-slaves. 2%. But they were known for this greatness of citizenship, identifying individuals. Even if you had been a conquered people, to gain citizenship, you would have this class that would be recognized, and this was very different. Any other former empire, once you're a conquered people, you're just enslaved, that's it, period. That's, you don't pass go, you don't collect $200. But for Rome, it was different. They recognized citizenship, and you could buy into that citizenship. And the Roman Empire was also different in one other way. They recognized the limits of their power, of how they could keep an empire together. Before that, Alexander the Great, Darius, Xerxes, all of these great kings of ancient history couldn't help themselves. They wanted to just take it one step further, one step further, one step further. But they crumbled and fell upon themselves because their empires got so large they couldn't manage them. Rome, on the other hand, understood that. And then what they did was they would set up these governorships and provinces just like the Medes did, but when they would do that, they kind of drew a line and says, you know what, that's out of our sphere of influence. You could read that today in international relations classes about the United States, our empire, and the sphere of our influence, and the sphere of China's influence. Who really should be controlling the South China Sea or something like that? Because it's out of our sphere of influence, but it's in their backyard. So that's the difference. Well, that's what Rome recognized. And so what happened with Rome, they got so large because other small countries wanted to be protected, and they wanted the protection of Rome. So they actually asked to be pulled into the system. Because if you have let's say the Lydians or the Scythians coming out of Afghanistan and they're raiding you all the time, maybe you're looking for protection. You want some autonomy, but you want protection, so you appeal to the Roman government, and they're like, well, that's pretty far out there, but if you pay us tribute, we'll send soldiers and legions your way. And pretty soon they ran out of those, didn't they? Because they were having such a good time glorifying themselves, right? And idolizing, pleasure and sexual pleasures and all that. They got so busy with that. The legions were no longer Roman, but they were what? They were the slave classes. They were the other people. They were mercenaries. And then that's why we see Rome just crumbling from the inside. When we get to Daniel chapter 3, we need to remind ourselves at the end of chapter 2, when the dream is told, the reaction of Nebuchadnezzar. He falls down to worship Daniel because he knows there's this great miracle that has been done. And when he falls down, he says, of a truth, your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, the revealer of secrets. But when he says that, he's a true pagan. It's not that your God is the only God, but he has been impressive to tell us, and he's the only one that could reveal the dream to me. So he's the God of gods and the Lord of kings. But Nebuchadnezzar, being the great builder that he was, had already built so many temples in Babylon, and the temple of Ishtar and the temple of Marduk, and he had finished 5 others along with the terraces of the Hanging Gardens. He was known as an incredible builder. And he was pagan through and through, and he would recognize that, yes, now the God of the Israelites is a true God, and he's a powerful God, and he's the only one that can interpret these dreams. But that's as far as his recognition would go. And he would not recognize and does not recognize that any moral code is tied to the gods. And that's going to be important when he turns around and goes out to the plains of Dura in chapter 3 and he builds a big image. This golden image that he set up is 60 meters or 60 cubits by 6 cubits at the base. So if you were thinking about it in today's terms, that would be about 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. So it would be more like an obelisk. And I know that because I talked to a world-class architect whose minute, of drawings is probably worth several $1,000s per minute. But he did it for free for us, and he drew one up. And what that would look like is more of an obelisk than an image. Sometimes when you think, well, it's an image of Nebuchadnezzar. No, this is not a person's image. It may have Nebuchadnezzar's face on it. It may have just been some writing at the top. It may have been the symbols of Nebuchadnezzar's power. It was probably all to do with Nebuchadnezzar, because the language is, it's not to a god, it's to worship the image that I set up. Or otherwise, we would have been told what the image was, what it represented. So it's probably Nebuchadnezzar. And why? Because he's been told in the dream, and he has it on good authority from the spirit of the gods through Daniel, that he was what? The head of gold. So isn't it natural now, when that begins to kind of solidify and ferment in him, that he's going to go out and make this image in gold, gold-plated no doubt, and then set it up in the plains of Dura, and he would expect everybody to bow down and worship this? That would have been very plain. But you know what? What we see here is, now this is, of course, written in the Chaldean language. This is Aramaic at the time, and this is very legal language. When you read chapter 3, you know you're reading legal language, right? Lawyers can take something and they just absolutely destroy it where you can't even understand the contract, but they're doing it for a purpose. Well, that's the way this reads. It's going to be very repetitive. It's going to have every item in there, and then also when it gets to the instruments, they're going to be kind of a Greek derivation. And some of those instruments themselves were probably an influence that had come over from Greece, as well as there are people in his palace and in his kingdom that are Greek. We know that now. This at one time was one of those skeptics where they, oh, look, he's using Greek terms for these instruments. Well, he had Greeks all around him, so it was very natural. But when he does this, it's going to be this legal language, and he's going to set it up on the plains of Dura. We don't know where that is, but there are high mounds just south of Babylon proper that never were, as they were excavated, they found that there wasn't a whole lot built there, so it was almost like an open park or something like that. It would have been very natural, maybe. That would have been the meeting place where they could have set this thing up. And he says, whoever falls not down and worships in the same hour will be thrown into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. You know, when I was young growing up, I thought that just sounded so, like backward and archaic. Folks, you don't know anything about history like I didn't if we don't think this is absolutely the way mankind works. Coercion about what those in power want done. When the Catholic Church had married up with the Empire of Rome in about 324, right? It was the religion of Rome under Constantine. It didn't take them very long to try to snuff out all independent thinking about the Bible and Bible doctrines, where they begin to persecute with fire families, women, children that were trying to learn the Bible in English. They could control God's message if it was written in Latin and it was only interpreted by the priest and you didn't have a copy of the Bible. And if you broke that law, they would burn you at the stake. And then they would go off and worship and do their priestly duties. We see that as drastic contradiction. I'm telling you, the world is built on coercion. When the USS Philadelphia was captured in 1803, and Bob knows this well, by the Barbary Coast Wars, and it was off the coast of Tunis and Tripoli, and they pulled those sailors in, they converted them and tried to convert them through coercion. There was this torturous circumcision thing that they did, and a lot of the sailors opted for it because they were going to be treated much better as prisoners and slaves if they would convert to Islam. And that was what Thomas Jefferson was dealing with when he took over the office. And he knew that they would only understand one thing. And they really thought he was, well, hey, maybe we can negotiate. No, there's no negotiation. He knew that they were only going to understand power. And so that's why in the Marine Corps hymn, John would sing, "To the Shores of Tripoli." Now that happens, and it's happened through history. And when Martin Luther was going into the diocese, or he was going to go up into this big building where they were going to have his trial, Sir Frederick was this knight that had scars on his face and scars on his body, and he had been in these tunic wars and all of these wars with swords and spears, the kind that you don't come out unscathed. You know, even if you win, you're pretty messed up. And so then he comes out and he sees Martin Luther being led into this where all of the jeering has already started and all the priests are ready to try him as a heretic. And Martin Luther begins to lose his nerve. He was shaking and he was afraid and he was stooped over and he was shoulders. And they said he was walking like a dead man going up to this trial. And Sir Frederick stepped out of the crowd and he put his hand on his shoulders. He says, "Thou art about to make a stand such as I and my comrades in arms have never had to make in the hottest of the battles." He said, "God be with you." And with that, Martin Luther realized so many people in the world had suffered so many things, and he wasn't alone. And he began to stand a little taller. And they said he began to march a little straighter. And he walked in to make his famous speech. And in the end, he would look up at that jeering crowd and say, "Here I stand." People have had to do that throughout history. In Revelation chapter 2, when Jesus said, "You will go through persecution. You will be tried. And Satan will try you, and there will be this tribulation, and it will last for 10 days. That means it's going to be complete. And we think, well, God will take care of us. And he says, "Oh, yes, I will, but here's how it's going to be done. You be faithful unto death." Why unto death? Because they were going to die. And I'll give you the crown of life. And we have the nerve to say, well, that means live faithful. No, it doesn't. It means when somebody's about to throw you in the fiery furnace, you still stand for God. And you don't have the option to say, "You know what, I'll try to get out of this now and work for him later." He says, "No, I'd rather have you die. I'd rather have you make a stand. I'll take care of the rest of history. If the Christians would stand, I will take care." And that's why in 324 they took over the Roman Empire. They had been persecuted for 10 persecutions. Diocletian was the worst. But the way they took the persecution made the Roman citizenship change their entire mind about Christianity. God will use it for his good. We're only to fulfill our own duty. And we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I can guarantee you, these men were not men of faith only. Ask yourself this. Do you want to build a church and a kingdom on a doctrine of faith only? Because someday, sooner or later, God may put us in the cauldron, and it would be our turn in the barrel, and the person beside you may be faith only. How are they going to react rather than somebody that says, "No, it's obedient faith even unto death"? And you make that decision when? When the fire hits your body? No. You make that decision years before. Years before, when your professor throws the Bible in the trash can and makes fun of your belief. Years before, when your friends leave you and say, "Okay, but you're not going to hang out with us because you got all of these odd beliefs." Years before, when you make a stand. That's when you make the decision. It's too late when you get to the fire. It's too late when you get to the sword. That's why I cringe. When I think about my own case, when I think about the times that I haven't spoke up when I should have, and I'm thinking, well, if I didn't speak up when I should have, and when I had the opportunity, what makes me think I'm going to be able to stand before the fire? Christians in the past have taught us how to do that, and these young men certainly have. You know, Nebuchadnezzar asked a very strange question. He said, "Who is that God that is able to deliver you from my hand?" Why did he ask that? Why did he ask it that way? Why didn't he say, "What or how are you going to get out of this? What are you thinking? I'm going to give you another chance." Why did he give him another chance? Because he was familiar with them. You could tell he almost had a turn of heart. This isn't the same guy that plucked out the eyes of Zedekiah right after he saw his sons tortured to death and led off to Babylon. That was Nebuchadnezzar that did it. But here Nebuchadnezzar knows these men, and he changes his attitude, and then he suddenly says, "I'm going to give you another chance." But he doesn't say, how did you think you were going to get out of this? He says, who is the God that will deliver you from my powerful hand? Because he knows, doesn't he? He already knows these men and their reputation. Their reputation precedes them. He already knows why they didn't have their nose in the dirt. He already knows who they took a stand for. Now he's questioning that. And they're going to answer that question. And they're going to say, oh, your highness. Oh, king, live forever. Oh, king, you're so great. Oh, king, you... No, they're just going to drop all of that tomfoolery of all the stuff in the world. They're going to say, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to even answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God is able. Our God is able. They knew he was. And it didn't even matter whether he was going to do it in that fiery furnace in the next minute or not. It didn't matter. They knew their God. He is able. If you want to know, it's our God. And he will deliver us from thy hand, O king, from the burning fire furnace in thy hand, O king. But if not, if it be so that you smell my flesh coming off my body, let me tell you this right now. We will not bow down to the world and all they have to do to coerce and the power they throw at us to stomp out truth. Truth. Remember, God said the wrath of God will be revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness and those who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. From day one in the garden, it's been a battle of truth. When Satan said, oh, you will not surely die, the entire world has been in a battle with Satan over truth. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are three young men that God's going to be able to use throughout the centuries to teach us the truth. Thanks so much for your time and attention.